Bill, as I think of God and I think of God's omniscience and I think of my own life, I feel that I'm in control of what I can ask you. I can ask you one question or another question. But traditional theology said God has absolutely determined the future or settled. Everything is settled. Is my ability to ask you one question or another settled in God's mind?
Well, I think that really depends, Robert, on what you mean by settled. And different theologians have different views of exactly what that means. For example, there are those who would follow John Calvin and Augustine in thinking that God's foreknowledge is based on his foreordination, that because God has decreed that everything that happens will come to pass, therefore he foreknows it, so that his foreknowledge is based upon his predestination of everything that happens. And that would remove, I think, significant human freedom.
So God knows that I'm going to do something basically because he made it such that I would.
That's correct. He's determined it.
Okay, that's one possibility.
That's one possibility. Another possibility, perhaps the other extreme, would be to say that God doesn't know the future and doesn't determine it, and therefore he gambles in creating human beings with free will because he doesn't know how they're going to react, and God takes risks. He knows probabilities, but he doesn't know what's going to happen, and he rolls the dice, so to speak, and hopes that things turn out for the best, and he works himself to try to make them turn out for the best.
The future is open.
Yes, not only is the future open on this view, but there aren't even any truths about the future that can be known by God, and God doesn't in any way abridge human freedom or control human beings. And as I say, he just doesn't have any knowledge of what's going to happen apart from what he could infer from present causes that exist, in the same way that you and I have a degree of foreknowledge of what's going to happen in the immediate future from present causes. But the farther you get into the future, the less you know. And similarly with God, he really doesn't know how it's going to turn out on this open view. So that would be the far extreme from the other end.
That sounds more exciting to me, not knowing what's going to happen.
Well, remember that in the quest for truth, we have to be very careful that we don't pick what appeals to us
Fair enough.
as what we
Fair
think
enough.
to be true. And I do think this is a real problem in this area. People want to create a God who is appealing to them, and therefore they tailor image their God to fit what they find exciting.
All right, so we've defined two boundary conditions.
Yes.
We've defined the preordination, where God knows the future because he's preordained it. Basically, he's making it happen.
Right.
The other boundary condition is that the future is open. God really does not know in detail or anything what's going to happen. He has it from probabilities.
And notice that these are actually rather close to each other. It's not like they're two different ends of a line. They're more like a circle that come back around because they're actually very close to each other. Both of these views agree that the only way God could know the future is if he determines it.
Right.
And so there's actually a rather common assumption behind both of these views.
And that's a free will kind of question. So in both cases, they both recognize the fact that if God predetermines something, basically that's the way he knows it.
Yes, that's correct. And so when those who hold to this openness view are confronted with examples of God's foreknowledge of the future, you find they collapse back into the foreordination view. They say, well, not everything is free. Some things are predetermined by God. Well, any biblical Christian then is left with the view that Peter was determined by God to deny Christ, that poor Judas was determined by God to betray Jesus, which certainly ought to leave one feeling very uncomfortable, but that these people were determined by God to do sinful acts. It makes God the author of evil.
Not only them, but everybody who sinned.
Well, not everybody, because remember, some views on the openness view, God doesn't know a lot of this.
Sure, on the
but
predetermined
with respect to the Judas and the Peter example, you see in Scripture, Jesus predicts that these events are going to happen. He knows they're going to happen. And so the openness people, because they say the only way you can know the future is if it's determined, have to say God determined that Judas would betray Jesus and Peter betray Christ. So they're really bedfellows with these determinists, because they both agree the only way God can foreknow the future is by determining it himself.
All right, now what's in the middle?
What's in the middle are a couple of different views. One would be the simple foreknowledge view, which would say that God doesn't determine the future. There is genuine free will of human beings, but that God knows what will happen in advance. So that God's knowledge, though chronologically prior to the event, is logically posterior to the event. God's knowledge doesn't determine the event. It's the event that determines what God foreknows. So on this model, God's knowledge of the future is rather like an infallible barometer of the weather. The barometer will always be right because it's infallible, but the barometer doesn't determine the weather. Whichever way the weather would be is what the barometer would indicate.
That sounds like reverse causation, or causation in a backward direction.
Now, that's a very perceptive remark, because I think it does have the same sort of effects or implications as backward causation. And it's very interesting that in scientific literature, quite apart from these debates in theology, there are debates about backward causation, time travel, relativity theory, and so forth, that arrive at similar conclusions, that just because something is in the future doesn't mean that it is determined by what happens in the present. Rather, the way the present is could be because these things will go differently in the future. Now, in the case of foreknowledge, I don't think it's a causal relationship. It's not like our choices cause God to believe something, but it is rather that our choices determine how certain propositions are true or false, and God, being omniscient, knows only in all true propositions, and so, in that sense, his knowledge is logically posterior to our actions.
The difference between the simple foreknowledge and the preordained foreknowledge is that in the preordained case, God is making it happen. In the simple foreknowledge case, he's just perceiving it in some way.
That's correct. In the simple foreknowledge case, there is genuine human freedom, and God simply knows how agents will freely choose, and if they were to choose differently, then he would have different foreknowledge.
But in both cases, it's 100% absolute, no exceptions.
Right.
God knows, end of story.
Right. But the one is consistent with the ability to do otherwise, and the other one isn't.
Yes. Okay. Anything else?
Well, there's a fourth view that we haven't talked about, and that's the view called middle knowledge. And it adds a sort of extra explanatory dimension to the simple foreknowledge view by explaining how God has knowledge of the future with respect to free actions. And what it holds is that prior to God's decision to create the world, God knows how any free creature would freely choose in any circumstances God might place him in. So by choosing to create certain circumstances and put certain creatures in them, God's foreknowledge comes as a result. He knows exactly then how that creature will behave because he knew what that creature would do if he were in those circumstances. So this gives God foreknowledge of the future on the basis of his knowledge of how persons would freely choose in any circumstances they might be placed in.
That seems to give a slightly bigger opening for free will.
Well, I don't think so, Robert. I think both of them are entirely consistent with human free will.
Both of them, the simple foreknowledge
and the middle knowledge. But what the middle knowledge approach does offer is an explanation of God's providential control over human history without abridging human freedom. It shows how it is that God can plan a universe which will ultimately arrive at his ends through the free decisions of creatures. In opposition to that, the simple foreknowledge view has the rather odd consequence that God must be totally surprised, in a sense, at the way things turn out. He knows the way they will turn out, but that's not a result of his planning it, because there isn't any logically prior moment at which he says, here's the way everyone would behave in all these different circumstances, so I'm going to create these circumstances, put these people in them, and that way I know what's going to happen. Instead, he just sort of wakes up, as it were, and finds himself with knowledge of the future and of the way everything will be, but there isn't any account of how he got this sort of knowledge and of his providence over
Now,
human history.
that makes it sound like there's less free will, in a sense, in that argument.
In which one?
In the middle knowledge argument, because then God is choosing a world in which he knows what would happen, and so that seems to constrain human free will more than in the simple foreknowledge if he just wakes up and knows what's happening.
I think that what you're discerning is that this is truly a mediating position between the extremes. The determinists say this allows too much human freedom because God doesn't determine how the persons will act in these circumstances. The open theists say this is too deterministic because God is the one who chooses which world it is. And I find myself comfortably in the middle between the two, saying that it affirms both divine sovereignty and human freedom. One defender of this middle knowledge point of view put it in this way, it sounds paradoxical, but I think so nicely captures it. He says, it is up to God whether we find ourselves in a world in which we are predestined, but it is up to us whether we are predestined in the world in which we find ourselves.